Secret societies that are supposed to rule the world from the shadows are not secret at all. A conference room in a luxury hotel in Davos. CEOs, politicians, billionaires laugh as they pose for photos. They do not hide in subterranean vaults. They do not wear masks or occult robes. Their meetings are live-streamed, their minutes published in public reports. Yet millions persist in the belief that real power lurks behind symbols and rituals. That belief is not the discovery of a secret. It is the most successful act of propaganda ever produced. An illusion staged to conceal the genuine power operating fully in plain sight. You felt the shock of that opening. It hurts because it contradicts the movie image you carry. Now let's step back and rehearse the version everyone learned in school and on screen, the tidy, polished myth that makes a complicated world feel controllable. In the comfortable telling, secret societies stitch together the world's history like a single thread. Templars, Masons, Illuminati, the Priory of Sion, Skull and Bones. These names circulate like incantations. They appear in thrillers and box office hits. They hover across best-selling novels, late-night documentaries, and viral YouTube series. The pattern is always the same. Ancient order, hidden rituals, forbidden knowledge, and a handful of initiates pulling the levers behind every revolution and catastrophe. Listen to how that narrative is offered. There is a map, go the stories, and someone reads it. Heroes and villains are sharply defined. Complexity collapses into intent. Accidents become plans. Randomness is recast as design. It is tidy, and it is reassuring. It gives gravity to chaos. It converts historical pain into a single blamable target. That's why the myth sticks. The popular image borrows theater, masks, altars, oaths. It borrows antiquity, whispers of Stone Age pacts and medieval conspiracies. It borrows certainty. A secret hand explains the inexplicable. These elements make for compelling film. They make for clickable headlines. They make for an entire sub-industry. Pundits, screenwriters, podcasters. For viewers, the myth is comforting. For storytellers, it is profitable. For those in power, it can be useful. Think about how satisfying that story is. When you hear a complicated political failure or an economic crash, the instinct is to ask, who planned this? You learned to look for villains in cloaks. You learned to believe that history bends at the design of a tiny elite. That frame did not arise by accident. It was cultivated. It feeds on our hunger for pattern and meaning. Now consider 3 short, clean scenes that illustrate the official myth as it is taught. First scene, a classroom. A teacher points to a map. This is the arc of influence, she says, and circles names. Masons, Illuminati, Knights Templar. The pupils nod. The map has neat boundaries and clear lines. Nothing messy, nothing awkward. Revolutions have tidy causes. Wars have precise architects. Second scene, a library shelf. Rows of books with embossed titles. The covers promise hidden histories, revealed secrets, the true rulers. They sit beside coffee table art books and sell well. Their blurbs are authoritative. Their readers close the book feeling they know more than most people. The narrative has the veneer of scholarship, citations, footnotes, confident assertions. But often those citations lead back to other sensational texts, not to primary archives. Third scene, a film montage. Sweeping music. A masked figure traces a sigil. A crimson candle guttering. An anonymous hand passes a folded note. A narrator intones, "They have always been here." The montage ends with a graphic, an all-seeing eye, a pyramid, a code. The audience applauds the tidy explanation. Complex mechanisms of finance or policy are reduced to hidden rites. Those scenes form the comfortable version. Aristocratic cabals orchestrate events. Secret rites confer power. Symbols are evidence. If you wanted to explain a migration crisis, an oil war, a banking panic, you could, in this frame, point to a room in which initiates conspired, and then the course of history changed. Why does this version matter? Because it offers an easy moral economy. If all wrongs trace back to a single conspiracy, then undoing the world's ills is a matter of exposing and defeating that conspiracy. The plan is simple. That simplicity is compelling politics. Now, who benefits from that simplicity? A short list. Those who profit from spectacle. Media outlets earn clicks, documentary makers earn views, authors sell copies. Political factions who want a clear enemy to mobilize against. Religious or ideological movements who prefer a demonizable adversary to an abstract set of structural problems. And, crucially, elites who find the attention drawn to arcane symbols a useful diversion. This is not accusation, it is explanation. The official version performs a political function. It externalizes blame. It converts systemic failure into targeted malfeasance. Before we go further, hear two quoted voices that encapsulate what the official story sounds like when it is most persuasive. An educator in a documentary voice. Elite lodges shaped revolutions when no one else had the imagination to see it. They guided nation after nation. It is a flat, authoritative tone. It beckons trust. A novelist's blurb. Behind every summit, an invisible hand writes history. These men, and sometimes women, use ritual to consolidate power. It is seductive, conspiratorial, and cinematic. Those lines are compact and convincing. They carry the cadence of certainties. They slide naturally into public conversation. But narratives that smooth complexity rarely survive close scrutiny intact. The official story depends on a few structural conveniences. The illusion of coherent continuity across centuries, the conferral of agency to tiny groups, and the erasure of counter-evidence. Any serious investigation quickly finds cracks. You watched the polished sequence. Now let's look for the seams. In the next section, we will begin to pry at the tale's most basic claims, its chronology, its evidence, and the implausible continuity it asserts. We will unpick three kinds of problems you probably never heard explained in your school. Before that, a quick human note. Thank you for staying with this investigation so far. This channel is small, and making work like this takes time. If this inquiry matters to you, subscribing helps the project grow so we can examine more stories your textbook skipped. Every new viewer makes it easier to keep following threads that lead where institutions would prefer you not look. Now, remember the tidy classroom map. Keep it in your head for a moment. We will return to it with different documents on the table, not the glossy editions, but the raw, stubborn records. The result will be less neat, much less. But it will be closer to what probably happened. Have you ever noticed how secrecy is presented like a brand? It has a logo, a costume, a motif. The official myth asks you to accept costume for cause, and that is the first fissure. Real histories do not come gift-wrapped. They arrive in bureaucratic language, in ledgers, charters, petitions, legal decrees. When you begin to open those dry boxes, the glamorous story frays. That is where we begin, with contradictions you can point to, documents you can read, and questions that make the comfortable tale wobble. The first fracture is obvious and visual. Visibility. How can a secret ruling class be so remarkably public? Look around. Masonic lodges have websites. Their halls advertise open days. The Grand Lodges publish annual reports. They operate retail shops. Many have museums with guided tours. If your image of a secret society requires ritual cloaks and subterranean chambers, meet the glossy brochure and the accessible visitor center. The paradox alone should make you pause. Consider the Masons. In countless cities, their buildings bear plaques, and their membership rolls appear in directories. If a group wanted to be invisible, this is not a clever way to do it. The simplest explanation is often the truest. Many of these organizations are social clubs. They exist to network, to give, to commemorate. They use ritual to temper social bonds, ritual as civics, not as a cult governance. The second crack concerns timeline and continuity. A central claim of the mythology is that certain orders have maintained a line of influence across centuries, guiding politics across ages. But chronology refuses to cooperate with that neatness. Many supposed ancient orders are modern inventions or rebrandings. The Bavarian Illuminati, the favorite of sensational histories, existed in the late 18th century for barely a decade before suppression. Templars, mythologized as pan-European masterminds for 1,000 years, were a medieval order that rose and fell over 2 centuries. The gap between the Templars and the modern conspiracy myth is vast and poorly bridged by evidence. Historians point this out not because they want to dismiss all intrigue, but because temporal distance matters. An organization that collapses under pressure, that is publicly outlawed and disbanded, cannot simultaneously be the invisible author of subsequent events unless we invent a fictional mechanism of resurrection. The myth requires continuity that reality rarely supplies. Third, examine failure. If an invisible cabal controlled events flawlessly across centuries, we should see a pattern of unbroken success. Instead, we see mistakes, defeats, internal disputes. The Illuminati were suppressed. The Templars were arrested and their leadership executed. Masonry in the United States suffered sharp, violent backlash in the early 19th century, including anti-Masonic political movements and legal restrictions. If these groups were puppeteers of history, they were extraordinarily bad at protecting themselves. That raises a question: why assume omnipotence when the record shows vulnerability? Fourth, the most damning fissure is the evidence, or its absence. Countless treasure hunts, archaeological expeditions, and archival searches have attempted to locate the smoking gun. The ledgers, the hidden correspondences, the secret edicts proving a perpetual clandestine command. None have produced a definitive chain of documents showing a continuous, central plan originating in a single room to direct successive wars, revolutions, and global fashions. Absence of evidence is not always evidence of absence, but when you combine the lack of documents with the public records showing financial transactions, minutes, and civic engagement by members, the idea of a monolithic secret government becomes harder to sustain. Let's be concrete. Many claim the Masons orchestrated the French Revolution. If you look at revolutionary archival material, club proceedings, pamphlets, economic data, lists of grievances, the revolutionary momentum aligns more closely with economic crisis, state insolvency, and the spread of Enlightenment ideas than with a conspiratorial directive. The Baruel-Arbison pair, 2 late 18th century authors who drew causal lines from secret societies to upheaval, did not introduce new primary evidence. They synthesized fear, anecdote, and anecdotal coincidence into a persuasive narrative for conservative readers terrified of change. So far, we have 4 structural problems: visibility, discontinuity, failures, and lack of primary evidence. Each one does not destroy the myth alone, but together they create a pattern. The accepted story is porous where it claims to be watertight. Now shift the lens to motive and modern incentives. Why has the myth endured and proliferated? What interests does it serve? Start with human psychology. People crave stories with clear villains. Chaos is terrifying. A single adversary simplifies responsibility and promises a decisive fix. The narrative also offers social identity. If you belong to a group that claims knowledge of the secret, you feel special. That is a powerful social glue. Next, consider politics. Counter-revolutionary movements in the late 18th and 19th centuries found the Masonic plot narrative useful. It allowed elites to name a single hidden antagonist rather than admit that inequality, hunger, and poor governance drove people to revolt. Blame the invisible hand, not your policy failures. That rhetorical leverage is irresistible to those who must explain or justify political breakdown. Then, the 20th century adds more toxic fuel. Anti-Semitic currents found the conspiracy frame convenient. The protocols of the Elders of Zion fabricated a comprehensive plan and attached it to an entire people. The protocols were a forgery, but they spread widely and were reused by regimes with a need for a single scapegoat. The myth evolved into an instrument of exclusion and violence. Finally, the Internet amplifies. Algorithmic platforms favor engagement. Sensational claims, symbols on a music video, a celebrity handshake, an odd hand gesture, create spikes in views. Creators discovered that decoding supposed clues builds audiences. The system rewards sensationalism. It rewards pattern-seeking even when the patterns are spurious. Conspiracy communities become echo chambers where claims self-replicate, each new video or viral post lowering the threshold for belief. So the myth persists because it is psychologically comforting, politically useful, and commercially profitable. Worse, the myth becomes a feedback loop. The more people chase the myth, the more content there is, the more it seems plausible to newcomers. Algorithms then recommend more of the same. A trivial image can be processed into a grand narrative. At this point, you should be asking, if not the secret cabal, what explains real influence? This is the pivot point. Real power operates not behind mystical curtains, but in broad daylight through mechanisms that are less cinematic but far more consequential. Consider lobbying. Corporations and interest groups spend billions to shape legislation. They hire lawyers, PR firms, and former officials. The mechanism is transparent in principle. Filings, disclosures, meetings. And yet its cumulative effect escapes easy public comprehension. A single meeting at Davos does not appear as a criminal conspiracy. It appears as routine networking. But tens of thousands of routine meetings across sectors shape norms, regulations, and the architecture of markets. Influence is structural. It accumulates. Consider campaign finance. Funding flows into elections through PACs and dark money channels. Money buys access, often through legal but ethically fraught means. This is not secret ritual. It is an institutionalized, well-documented system that channels preferences into policy outcomes. It is boring on the surface. It is devastating in aggregate. Consider the media ecosystem. Ownership concentration shapes which stories get attention. Who owns a network matters. These are public facts in filings and corporate records. But the effect, what topics are normal to discuss, which narratives are amplified, creates a political atmosphere favorable to some actors and hostile to others. These mechanisms do not feature masks or symbols. They feature contracts, campaign filings, lobby reports, corporate minutes. They function in daylight. They are complex, distributed, and often legal. That makes them harder to condense into a single villain, and easier to ignore in a culture primed for dramatic secrets. Back to the myth, then, with fresh eyes. You learned a compelling story, where you needed a pattern. The pattern existed, but not the one you expected. Real power is a network of legal, visible, and often mundane practices. Secret society lore was a narrative shortcut, and shortcuts can be politically weaponized. We are not saying there are no clandestine plots. Of course there are. States and factions conspire, covert operations happen, black budgets are real. But these are not the same as a timeless, global order operating with the same cohesion over centuries. Covert actions have contexts, motives, and constraints. They are messy, they leak, they are often uncovered. The myth, by contrast, imagines a flawless continuity that is not supported by the archival record. At this stage, small puzzles remain and are worth noting. Why do certain symbols recur? Why do elites sometimes adopt theatrical behaviors? Two answers. First, symbols are portable social capital. Clubs use rituals and insignia to build shared identity. Second, elites enjoy theatricality because it cements status. Theater is not evidence of occult governance, it is evidence of social performance. We must also be precise about culpability. Pointing to structural power, lobbying, media ownership, tax havens, does not absolve individuals of responsibility or intent. Rather, it reframes culpability from the mystical to the institutional. When a company avoids taxes through legal constructs, the harm is real though the method is legal. When regulators rotate into corporate boards, conflicts of interest arise. These are not mysteries, they are policy problems. At the close of this section, the question you must carry forward is practical. If the conspiracy myth distracts, what should a citizen do instead? Start with clarity. Study the visible levers: campaign finances, corporate filings, lobbying disclosures, regulatory capture. Demand transparency where it is missing. Support investigative journalism that follows money and law, not rabbit holes of symbolism. Build institutions that make mundane influence legible and accountable. We will return to specific archival cases and scene-by-scene reconstructions. In the next segment, we will start opening the actual documents, the accounts and the proclamations that show how myths were made and why they were politically useful. For now, the essential point is this: the breathtaking, cinematic narrative of a timeless cabal is a story made for comfort, profit, and political convenience. The real architecture of power is messy, legal, visible, and stubbornly boring. And precisely because it is boring, it is easier to overlook. That oversight is the greatest danger. Behind the gilded imagination of secret rites and subterranean councils, there is a quieter, flatter truth. Walk with the camera into a town where a Masonic lodge sits under a brass plaque, its oak door polished by decades of hands. Inside, there are folding chairs, a battered ledger on a small table, a calendar of charity dinners, and a list of members' names, occupations, subscription amounts. The scene is ordinary in the way that matters. It is bureaucratic, mundane, stubbornly public. You learned the image from thrillers: hooded initiation, whispered oaths, an invisible hand shaping nations. Now picture instead a clerk at dawn decoding invoices, a treasurer balancing petty cash, a committee arguing over whether to repaint the meeting hall. Those minutes, plain language, dates, signatures, are archival facts. They show debates about dues, about dinner menus, about whether to fund a schoolroom in the next county. Ritual survives, in many cases, as ritual, but its function is social cohesion, not clandestine governance. Consider another corridor, the Bohemian Club, a redwood grove in Northern California, where each summer men in blazers gather for a private retreat. The satellite camera catches laughter, a badly sung amateur play, a late-night cigar, a nervous age shifting between conversations. John Ronson called it a boozy camp for the overworked rich, and the scene matches: old jokes, petty grievances, displays of status. To call that a cell of occult policymaking is to mistake sociality for a strategic boardroom. Then there is Bilderberg, name that conjures a world historical cabal. In practice, it is a series of closed conferences where business executives, policymakers, and commentators meet in hotel ballrooms. People shake hands, exchange cards, eat the same bland chicken, and sometimes announce public reports that were already being drafted. The real leverage of such meetings is cumulative and diffuse, not a secret sinew of command, but an accumulation of relationships that smooth the passage of ideas across sectors. A single conversation between a minister and a CEO does not equal a directive. Repeated encounters over years create shared assumptions and tacit alignments. Look at the records that actually exist: municipal registries, charity filings, press releases, websites with membership invitations and histories, museum plaques with dates and benefactors, pamphlets advertising open days. In many towns, the Masonic Lodge is a visible civic building, cornerstone laid, name engraved. If your model of secrecy requires shadow catacombs and invisible ledgers, the evidence will force you to revise the model. Visibility is the first fissure. Another fissure is continuity. The myth depends on an unbroken line.
An order founded in one century survives intact into the next, carrying an identical program and steady influence. Reality is messy. Some orders, Knights Templar, Bavarian Illuminati, flared, collapsed, and left scattered traces. The Templars were powerful bankers and warriors in the medieval Mediterranean, but they lasted about 2 centuries before a rapid and spectacular fall in France. The Illuminati existed for less than a decade before being suppressed. Institutions evolve, dissolve, merge, names are recycled by later actors who wear them like costumes. When an organization collapses in the record, when its leaders are arrested, its property seized, yet the legend claims continuous omnipotence, a logical contradiction appears. How does a dissolved order simultaneously plan revolutions? The answer demanded by the myth is magical, resilience without evidence. The historian reads the probate records, the confiscation lists, the trial transcripts. She traces discontinuities and finds networks that scatter, not a phoenix that rises intact. The myth requires continuity the archives do not support. Failure is telling. If a group were omnipotent across centuries, it would shield itself from legal annihilation, from public exposure, from severe internal dissent. But the historical record instead shows arrests, schisms, public denunciations, counter-movements. Masonry in the United States faced violent anti-Masonic agitation in the 1820s and 1830s, lawsuits, mobs, a political party built to oppose them. The Illuminati of Bavaria were outlawed in the 1780s. The Templars' leadership was executed in the early 14th century. These are not the actions of an infallible, omniscient machine. They are the marks of organizations embedded in contested human politics. The most damning fissure is documentary absence. For a claim that a tiny cabal orchestrated a string of revolutions and wars across continents, the weight of archival evidence is surprisingly light. Treasure hunts, sensational claims, cinematic reconstructions have not produced a continuous chain of private decrees or a ledger of instructions signed by a hidden council that directly caused, for example, the French Revolution. Instead, scholars point to public financial records, pamphlets, club minutes, economic pressures, and intellectual movements as proximate causes. The absence of a smoking gun manuscript is not a definitive disproof. Rumors can persist where documents do not. But when public archives are full of mundane detail and private caches are not suddenly teeming with global decree, the hypothesis loses plausibility.
So why, if the public record is so prosaic, do people keep telling the cinematic version? 2 answers dovetail: human psychology and political utility. Ritual and symbol feel like evidence. People crave narratives with tidy villains. It is psychologically easier to hold a single antagonist than to navigate systemic complexity. To belong to a group that claims privileged knowledge is to acquire emotional reward, status, community, certainty. Those small satisfactions sustain the myth. Politically, the narrative is serviceable. Blaming hidden cabals allows elites to deflect responsibility for failure. Economic collapse becomes the work of sinister hands rather than policy mistakes. For counter-revolutionaries in the late 18th and 19th centuries, naming a Masonic plot was rhetorically potent. It turned social grievances into exotic malevolence, far easier to combat than structural reform. That rhetorical move survives. Naming a conspiracy moves public debate from addressing poverty to demonizing an enemy. Commercial incentives accelerate the spread. Books, documentaries, and now videos that promise to decode a secret ladder of power are highly clickable. The market rewards mystery because mystery retains attention. A symbol on a music video or an ambiguous hand gesture is a clickbait seed. Content creators turn pattern hunting into content pipelines. Algorithms reward engagement. Engagement funds the content. The result is an ecology that prizes explanation over evidence. Yet there are forms of influence we must not ignore because they lack cinematic form. Lobbying is not a masked right. It is a system of filings, meetings, revolving doors, and sustained pressure. Campaign finance is documented but opaque. Donations, PACs, dark money intermediaries. Media ownership is recorded in corporate filings that matter more than any secret handshake. These mechanisms are legal, dull, complex, and consequential. They do not fit into a thriller, but they explain far more than an invisible cabal ever could. This is the central irony. The conspiracy myth distracts precisely because it looks like power. It decorates power with ritual and mystery, so we will look for esoteric signatures instead of following the money. Theatricality deflects scrutiny from contracts and corporate minutes. While we chase symbolic breadcrumbs, structural influence grows in plain sight. At this point, the question becomes practical. If you value real change, where should your attention go? Begin with transparency. Study the legal instruments of influence: campaign filings, corporate reports, lobbying disclosures. Support investigative journalism that follows money and policy. Insist on reforms that make mundane levers of power legible and accountable. The cinematic delight of a secret brotherhood will not reform tax codes or end regulatory capture. Practical pressure will. But first, we must understand how an early, brutal manipulation crystallized the public imagination. There is an origin story that reads like a medieval thriller because it was staged to be received that way. A royal sweep, a public spectacle, victims made into villains. The arrest of a powerful order and its theatrical dismantling created a template for centuries of accusation. That moment is worth pausing on. It explains how spectacle became evidence and how a regime learned to weaponize narrative. What happened then will change the way you see the myths you were taught, and it will show you the first time a public show of evidence was actually a political lie. The scene moves us from the lodge to the scaffold, and to a lesson about how power manufactures its enemies. Paris, October 13, 1307. The day opens in gray light and frost. The city has not yet shaken off night. Cobbled streets are slick under boots. The royal writ moves like a small army. Clerks, men-at-arms, magistrates, carrying orders sealed with the king's insignia. They do not knock at a single door.
They come at dawn to dozens of commanderies at once. The order is precise and violent. The targets are the Knights Templar, an order that has accumulated wealth, property, and a network of influence stretching from the Levant to the courts of Europe. They operated as warriors and, crucially, as custodians of credit. Knights deposited assets and received letters of credit. That function, financial and transnational, made them useful and unnerving to a crown that needed cash. Witnesses in chronicles and court records describe the arrests in the language of spectacle. Men are taken in ceremonial robes. Their insignia are cut away. They are marched through public streets. The action is both law enforcement and theater. The charges are dramatic: heresy, idolatry, sodomy. Accusations that, once pronounced from pulpits and read aloud in town squares, do not merely punish, they shame and erase. It is important to note what the record also shows: torture. Under interrogation, men said what they were made to say. Confessions extracted under duress filled pages later read aloud to stir public outrage. The king's use of force extended to the legal fabric. Trials were expedited, papal processes compromised under royal influence, assets seized. The politics is raw and deliberate. The motive, historians agree, is clear. The crown needed resources and centralized authority. 7 years later, on March 18, 1314, Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master, burned on an island in the Seine. Accounts emphasize the ritual of his death, a public burning, a final curse allegedly hurled at the king and pope. The image feeds legend, a noble order destroyed by the state and its clerical ally. But look closer. The event is also a clean act of elimination. It severs a powerful corporate body from its resources. It signals a redistribution of power.
This was not mere punishment. It was a precedent. Public ritualized denouncement established a template. When a ruler faced an opponent he could not otherwise control, he might manufacture a moral case. Heresy, sodomy, treason, presented as evidence to a public already primed by sermons and court announcements. Those charges were performative. Their theatrality concealed administrative motives. Imagine the echoes. Pulpits ask how such rot could grow within a sacred order. Sermonizers do the rhetorical work of enlarging small crimes into cosmic betrayal. Town criers disseminate the narrative. Chronicles, hand-copied and later printed, record the story. Over time, the story acquires a moral clarity that benefits those in power. It explains confiscation as piety, expropriation as justice. The Templar case also gave the political class an instructive model. First, it showed how judicial procedure could be bent, how torture and coerced confessions could be made to look like proof. Second, it taught the efficacy of spectacle. Public executions and denunciations create the impression of comprehensive moral clarity. Third, it illustrated how accusations of secret rites and idolatry function as rhetorical torpedoes. They are difficult to disprove, and they stigmatize by association. A key scene is instructive. Picture a church packed with citizens, a parchment read aloud detailing lurid claims, the priest lowering his voice to sanctify the announcement. A crowd reacts, a mixture of horror, relief, and a certain civic satisfaction. People want villains. The king offers a narrative where he, upholding order, has cut out a cancer. The crowd does not ask about finance. It prefers narrative. That preference is political oxygen. What followed the Templar dissolution was not only the redistribution of wealth, it was the seeding of a cultural logic. Elite conflicts could be reframed as moral crusades. Institutions could be delegitimized by ascribing to them secret, obscene deviancies. That logic made it simpler to explain complex failings. Economic collapse could be blamed on hidden corruption rather than on poor fiscal policy.
But the history is not a tidy moral parable. There were resistances, counter-voices, and contradictions. Some ecclesiastics hesitated. Some nobles balked at the wholesale seizure of property. Records show negotiations, bribes, papal vacillation. The collapse was not unstoppable, but contingent, a product of timing, alliance, and opportunism. You should also notice the administrative afterlife of the operation. The machinery used, the royal writs, the coordination of local officials, the rapid transfers of property, was not a one-off improvisation. It became a technique deployed again and again with variations. The vocabulary of secrecy and ritual began to be enlisted as a tool. Accuse, perform, confiscate, relabel. The pattern was durable because it exploited human tendencies, fear of contamination, appetite for scandal, and a basic cognitive shortcut favoring narrative closure. Consider finally the cultural residue. Even where the facts were ambiguous, the story of the Templars hardened into legend. Folk songs, ballads, later romances turned the episode into myth. Treasure tales sprouted, the lost wealth found in chests under remote chapels, feeding generations of treasure hunters and novelists. The medieval spectacle mutated into modern myth, a template for secret orders that both enthralled and explained. This is the nucleus of the darker narrative tradition, a state-sponsored spectacle that, when repeated and embellished, becomes a template for suspicion. Once a template exists, it is portable. It can be applied to Freemasons, to financiers, to bankers, to any group that appears both elite and opaque. The Templar story did not alone invent the conspiracy frame, but it provided a dramaturgy. Make the accusation visible, make the trial public, and the populace will accept the story because it was told in the language of moral theater. What is striking is not simply that the operation worked in its era, but that its logic lives on in political playbooks.
By calling someone secret and moral corrupt, power transforms complexity into moral simplicity. You can see the technique in later polemics. Paint an opponent as occult, sensationalize the claim, and the public will be less inclined to demand documents or detailed accounting. The Templar template is therefore not a medieval curiosity. It is a lesson in political communications. After the bonfire in Paris, the work of shaping public memory had only begun. Chronicles were written, sermons repeated the narrative. Over centuries, those elements accumulated, compressed, and recirculated. What remained a century later was not what had been detailed in the municipal ledgers, but an image. The knightly order as traitor, the crown as purifier. That image would be ready for other uses. The next movement in this story is modern, the machine that polished the medieval spectacle into a durable, transferable myth. It is the printing press, skilled pamphleteers, politicized clergy, and later mass media who would take the spectacle and convert it into a narrative currency. Once the narrative enters wider circulation in print and art, it acquires new life and new beneficiaries. The next act is therefore not medieval law, but the invention of propaganda, an industry of narratives that shape memory and influence. What followed in the early modern and modern eras will show how a political trick becomes a cultural habit, an inheritance that can be exploited 1,000 times over. The question is how exactly that conversion happened, and who profited from it most. The propaganda machine did not begin in a vacuum. It evolved from folklore and rumor into a deliberate set of techniques used by writers, priests, pamphleteers, and later modern ideologues. The mechanism is simple in outline. Frame an event, amplify the frame with accessible language, repeat it across media, and reproduce it in culture until the frame appears self-evident. The Templar spectacle was raw material. The early modern period provided tools. Jump to the late 18th century. Europe is convulsed by revolution and counter-revolution. In France and beyond, elites seek explanations that preserve their legitimacy. Enter Augustin Baruel and John Robison. In 1797, Baruel's Mémoire pour servir à l'histoire du jacobinisme proposed a malicious continuity. The French Revolution, he argued, was not an organic social upheaval, but the product of secret societies, Masons, Illuminati, plotting against church and crown. Robison, in Scotland, published similar claims. Their books were rhetorical formidables, erudite in tone, dense with citations, presented as scholarly refutations. Yet their citations often looped back to rumor and second-hand accounts. The effect was not purely academic. It handed conservative audiences a narrative that explained mass disorder without forcing them to examine inequalities or fiscal failures. This is a key mechanic of propaganda: authoritative form, sensational content. A book with footnotes looks like scholarship. A sermon with citations sounds unimpeachable. Combine the two, and you have a format that persuades readers who want an anchor. Baruel and Robison did not invent paranoia, but they packaged it in the language of reasoned critique. The narrative fed anxieties, and anxieties drive attention, a currency in the attention economy even then. Through the 19th century, the frame metastasized. Anti-Semitic elements were grafted onto older conspiracy scripts, culminating in the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. The protocols were a fabrication, documents concocted by the Tsarist secret police around 1900, yet their presentation as a plan had the same dramaturgic power as the Templar narrative: a hidden cabal, a published plan, a public alarm. The protocols traveled internationally and were seized on by multiple movements seeking a scapegoat. Later, Nazi propaganda used them as pseudo-evidence. Here again the technique is visible. Invent a document, circulate it widely, arm the narrative with the appearance of documentary truth. The 20th century amplified the method with new instruments. Radio, film, mass circulation newspapers, and state-controlled education made it easier to standardize stories at scale. Propaganda departments learned to use symbols, an eye, a pyramid, a hand sign, as short-circuit signifiers. In this environment, a symbol's visual economy mattered as much as an argument's logical force. Symbols travel fast. A striking image can do the rhetorical work of 100 pamphlets. Then came the Cold War, a period when both sides in a geopolitical struggle sought a monolithic antagonist. The international communist frame did for mid-20th century politics what the Masonic plot did in previous centuries. It provided a moral enemy that could justify extraordinary policies, mobilize resources, and silence dissent. The content shifted, the form persisted. By the time we reach the Internet era, the machine of myth-making acquires a suite of new accelerants, platforms, algorithms, and monetization. YouTube creators discovered that decoding music videos or celebrity gestures by pointing to alleged Illuminati links generated view counts. Algorithmic recommendation systems reward engagement, often indifferent to truth. A crackpot video that keeps viewers watching will be promoted more than a sober archival lecture. This perverse reinforcement turned myth-makers into micro-influencers. It turned amateur pattern recognition into a popular genre. What are the specific levers the propaganda machine uses across time? First, narrative templates. The hero-villain structure is recycled endlessly. Replace Templar with Illuminati or globalist and the story works the same way. Second, documentary aesthetics. Citations, archival scans, and recreated footage create a veneer of evidence. Third, cultural repetition. Novels, films, and pop music embed motifs into the public unconscious.
Fourth, institutional sponsorship. Political actors feed and weaponize the myths when convenient. The artisanal aspect of this machine is worth noting. Some propagandists are deliberate and state-backed. Others are opportunistic entrepreneurs seeking clicks. Both follow the same pattern. Identify a kernel of anxiety in the public, dress it with symbols, present evidence, and then amplify. Where mass media once required printing presses and distribution networks, a smartphone and an algorithm now suffice. There is also a strategic inversion at play. The very publicness of some elite meetings becomes a cover. A Davos panel is widely reported. That visibility contradicts the clandestine story. But that contradiction is turned into the myth's strength by rhetoricians. The more public, the more they must be brazen. Therefore, the secrecy is deeper. Visibility is reinterpreted as proof of cunning. This rhetorical sleight of hand keeps the story defensible despite counter-evidence. The propaganda machine does more than distract. It reassigns moral imagination. It offers shorthand villains and thereby surfaces certain political moves as acceptable. If a complex economic collapse can be explained as the result of a secret cabal, then policy responses will look like punishments against conspirators rather than structural reform. The rhetorical payoff is enormous. Obscene simplification yields political clarity, and clarity is actionable. We should be concrete. Take a contemporary example. A viral video claims that a celebrity's costume included Masonic symbols, and a fringe commentator asserts an economic link between that celebrity and a global bank. The video goes viral. Advertisers circle like sharks. Comments multiply. The algorithm boosts the content because people are outraged and linger. Within days, the rumor is amplified on other channels, then packaged into evidence by someone with a larger platform. The original claim may have been absurd, but the social dynamics have turned it into a cultural event. Meanwhile, the subtler mechanisms of influence, campaign donations, tax policy, regulatory capture, get no comparable treatment. This is not to say all conspiracy thinking is manufactured by elites. Grassroots distrust of institutions can be legitimate. But the propaganda machine exploits that distrust, naming easy enemies while hiding structural causes. The instructive element is not merely that myths spread. It is that they are often more useful to powerful actors than inconvenient truths. Finally, ask, who benefits? publishers who sell outrageous titles, broadcasters who attract audiences, politicians who need scapegoats, authoritarian leaders who exacerbate divisions to consolidate power, cultural industries that monetize spectacle. The beneficiaries are many and varied, which explains the myth's resilience. Propagandist power is also cultural and aesthetic. Film and fiction often rebroadcast the myth in more seductive forms. A blockbuster that features shadowy councils and ancient symbols reaffirms the schema. People absorb the aesthetic and map it onto real institutions. Tourism and merchandising then monetize the romance. Tours, t-shirts, collectible coins. The myth transmutes into economy. If the machine can make a medieval arrest into centuries of myth, it can also, conversely, be dismantled. Dismantling requires different resources: careful archival work, patient explanation, media literacy, algorithmic accountability, and political will to make the mundane levers of power more transparent. It also requires narratives that are less dramatic, but more accurate. Explanations of taxation, of lobbying networks, of regulatory capture insist on complexity in a culture that prefers villains. The end of this segment should leave you unsettled in a clear way. The propaganda factory is not an abstract enemy. It is a working system with identifiable tools and beneficiaries.
It transforms selective facts into totalizing stories, and those stories shape how people perceive the world, who they fear, and whom they blame. The next step is not merely to expose the machine's parts, it is to reconstruct the subject it misrepresented, to see the real architectures of influence beneath the drama. That reconstruction will not be cinematic. It will be stubborn, granular, and essential. The question now is, who will do the patient work of truth when spectacle pays so well? Now the honest portrait. Strip away the Gothic lighting, the pyramid emojis, and the cinematic score, and what remains is not a coherent cabal, but a network of people bound by ordinary desires: access, status, influence, safety, money, and sometimes genuine conviction. These organizations, lodges, clubs, invitation-only conferences are real. They keep records, issue invitations, advertise membership benefits. They host banquets, publish newsletters, coordinate charitable drives. Their rituals are not spells, but social technology. Ceremonies that turn acquaintances into obligations, secrets into shared identity, membership into a reputational asset. That is the first prosaic truth. Second truth: networks matter. When a handful of corporate directors, a minister, and a prominent editor sit at the same table, the chance conversations that follow can shift contracts, investments, even news cycles. Not because someone sits at the head of a hidden table drafting a global plan, but because each of these people holds levers of influence in public view: capital flows, regulatory sway, audience reach. Their informal conversations can channel information and create mutual expectations. That is influence without conspiracy, dense knots of reciprocity, not a single omnipotent mind. Third truth: symbols and ritual are theatrical glue. They create a sense that this is special. Call it branding for belonging. The arcane language, the handshakes, the staged initiations, they are marketing devices that turn networks into tribes. They lower friction. They make favors politics with a human face. You did me a small kindness. The ledger of obligation exists unspoken. That dynamic explains much of the power people attribute to these groups without needing a secret grand plan. But the honest portrait must be uncomfortable. It must contain contradictions. Elites who champion meritocracy while manufacturing closed doors. Philanthropists whose foundations benefit politically aligned institutions. Clubs that celebrate civic duty while lobbying for exemptions from the public rules they claim to uphold. It must acknowledge moral ambiguity.
People who pursue genuine public goods, founding hospitals, supporting schools, while also protecting rents and privileges for their circle. Real networks like these have mixed moral portfolios. They are sometimes engines of good, sometimes vehicles for privilege, often both at once. To make this readable, imagine 4 lenses sliding over the same figure. First lens, character. The public myth paints an archetype, mysterious, malevolent, unified. The evidence shows individuals, restless, anxious, persuasive, sometimes ruthless, sometimes philanthropic. They are human, not mythic. One banker might be obsessively private and politically naive. Another might be a populist donor who flirts with conspiracy talk to protect market advantages. Character is messy. It resists the tidy polarity of villain and saint. Second lens, objectives. The myth claims near omniscience, manipulate wars, collapse markets, set elections. The reality is narrower and pragmatic. Objectives are often immediate and local. Secure a merger, influence a regulation, preserve the value of an asset, ensure a friendly judge. Long-term ideological projects exist, but they are fewer and typically less coordinated. The logic of power here is incremental and opportunistic, not apocalyptic. Third lens, methods. The legend insists on occult rites and secret codes.
The reconstructed view shows negotiation, generosity tied to expectations, strategic philanthropy, hiring former officials, rotating board seats, and cultivating journalists. Methods include legal lobbying, campaign donations, funding think tanks, and subtle reputational nudges, tools that are overt and recorded, yet operate in the gaps that public scrutiny rarely reaches. Fourth lens, impact. The myth promises a global reset. The truth is distributional. Policy choices get nudged in ways that advantage those with social capital. Tax rules are crafted with loopholes that reward offshore structures. Land use is shaped by developers who know local councilors. Media narratives tilt because of advertising relationships. These outcomes are consequential, but they result from diffuse, systemic processes, not the stroke of a secret pen. Across these lenses, we must hold 3 methodological guardrails. 1. Label what we know with evidence, documents, minutes, financial disclosures, versus what we infer from patterns. 2. Acknowledge plausible but disputed interpretations as interpretations, not settled facts. 3. Avoid moral absolutes. The honest portrait asks uncomfortable questions without turning every questionable action into cosmic evil. Now a few concrete scenes, because cinematic truth lives in particulars. Picture a late winter evening in Geneva. A hotel ballroom, low light, 100 people in winter coats exchange business cards. A minister leans toward a tech CEO. They are both smiling, and the transcript, if it existed, would likely be banal. But in the next weeks, a procurement tender quietly narrows to the CEO's firm. There was no secret handshake that guaranteed the result, only pre-existing relationships and an overlapping interest structure that made the tender outcome more likely. Or imagine a provincial Masonic lodge. A group of tradesmen and professionals decide to fund a school library. That donation pays immediate dividends, books for kids, but also cements social ties, creates local obligations, and later perhaps a planning decision favors a member. The pattern repeats. Mundane acts, cumulative advantage. We should also expose the dramaturgy that feeds the myth. People love stories with sharp edges, heroes and villains, clean rituals and dramatic betrayals. The Templar bonfire of 1314 provides a perfect origin myth. Spectacle, accusation, confiscation, and the intoxicating image of a powerful body undone. That image is a narrative engine. It supplies metaphors for modern anxieties about elites. But metaphor becomes mistake when it replaces structural analysis.
If the Templars teach us how to tell a story, modern analysts must show the facts, how credit practices, royal finance, papal politics, and medieval legal norms combine to produce a particular outcome. The myth is seductive because it simplifies. The honest portrait is harder because it demands complexity. Here then is the inconvenient conclusion. The greatest danger is not that secret societies secretly rule the world, but that the myth of secret societies sedates scrutiny of public power. When attention is directed to mystical signs, it is diverted from the visible mechanisms that concentrate influence: campaign finance, corporate consolidation, media ownership, tax policy. The networks we have described work because they exploit legal and institutional channels, not because they are occult. They hide in the light. Finally, a practical note. The honest reconstruction of X is not a neutral exercise. It should not humanize to absolve. It should create pathways to reform. If influence flows through lobbying, then transparency reforms, tighter conflict of interest rules, campaign finance limits, and corporate governance changes are the appropriate responses. If culture amplifies myth, then education and media literacy are tools.
The righteous anger that fuels conspiracy fantasies can be redirected into democratic fixes if the public can be persuaded to care about the unglamorous levers of power. There is more. This reconstructed portrait raises a new problem: how the myth itself changes incentives. When elites discover they are being cast as Kabbalists, they sometimes double down on secrecy to protect reputation, which feeds suspicion, which then reinforces the mythology. The loop is self-feeding. That feedback loop is the fragile hinge between myth and policy, and it is where the next chapter begins. In the present moment, those cultural and institutional aftershocks are not historical curiosities. They shape elections, policy debates, and social trust right now. The next segment traces that trajectory, how a story born centuries ago became a living tool in 21st century politics and culture. The legacy of a forged story is not merely literary, it is infrastructural. The Templar spectacle taught a political lesson about the utility of accusation, and over centuries that lesson was repackaged, refined, and industrialized. To understand the present, follow three trails: political weaponization, cultural transmission, and technological acceleration. Start with political weaponization. Modern leaders use conspiracy frames as political ordnance. They do not always invent new myths, they reassign old ones. A useful image: a politician stands at a podium with a single name on the teleprompter: Soros, the elite, globalists, and the crowd supplies the rest. The claim is simple: there is a plan, and we are the people resisting it. That rhetorical move collapses structural critique, tax policy, austerity, neoliberal reforms, into a moral drama. The tactic is shockingly effective. It converts policy debates into identity struggles and discourages the nitty-gritty work of legislative oversight. Consider the Plan Soros frame in contemporary Hungary. Viktor Orban's rhetoric turned a philanthropist's public policy advocacy into an existential conspiracy. The result? Policy changes that curbed civic space, concentrated media ownership in regime-friendly hands, and created a political climate in which dissent is framed as foreign betrayal. Similar scripts appear elsewhere. Development aid becomes meddling. NGOs become shadow agents. Academic research becomes propaganda. The mechanism is classic. Label a visible opponent as part of a shadow network, delegitimize them, and then justify legal and economic countermeasures. Move to culture. Stories stick when they become consumable products. Publishing houses, film studios, and the music industry mind the conspiracy aesthetic because it sells. A blockbuster shot in a city square with arching camera movements and satanic symbols will spawn think pieces, YouTube dissections, reaction videos, and memes.
Each reiteration polishes the myth, compresses complexity into visual shorthand, and then monetizes outrage. Tourists buy Templar-themed trinkets. A best-selling novel names a shadowy cabal. A late-night host jokes about pyramid eyes. And the image solidifies into common sense. The protocols of the Elders of Zion show how this cultural root becomes lethal. Fabricated at the turn of the 20th century by elements of the Tsarist secret police, the document was framed as a leaked plan. It moved through print, retranslation, and political endorsement until entire states used it to justify exclusion, violence, and genocide. The protocols are the dark demonstration that once a narrative acquires a media pipeline and political sponsorship, it can produce catastrophic policy outcomes. Now bring in technology. The Internet and social platforms are not neutral highways for information. They are accelerants that favor hooks, emotional sparks that keep eyes glued. Algorithms reward engagement. Outrage is highly engaging.
A video claiming that a pop star's costume includes Masonic symbolism gets more watch time than a sober lecture on tax avoidance. Creators learn the formula. Insinuate pattern, provide evidence in the form of cropped stills and pedigreed-sounding citations, then amplify with calls to action. The platform ecology thus rewards stylistic sleight of hand. Algorithms do a second, less obvious thing. They create echo chambers. Someone watches one conspiracy video and the recommendation engine suggests 10 more, each slightly more eccentric. That cascade moves curious viewers into radicalized clusters. The social cost is severe, epistemic fragmentation. Two citizens inhabiting different algorithmically curated universes will witness the same event, an economic bailout, a public health measure, and construct widely divergent causal stories about who or what caused it. But the technological story has another face, monetization. Where audiences gather, markets follow. Influencers build brands around exposing the elite and sell courses, memberships, and merch. State actors sometimes seed narratives through proxy accounts or sympathetic influencers, blurring the line between grassroots rumor and coordinated informational warfare. The entire system monetizes distrust. There is a feedback loop between culture, politics, and technology. Cultural products codify myths. Political actors weaponize them. Platforms accelerate and monetize them. The process makes it cheaper to manufacture outrage than to produce evidence. That asymmetry changes incentives. A loud claim that feeds the algorithm and mobilizes a faction can yield immediate political benefit, while rigorous structural analysis, slow, painstaking, less shareable, yields long-term civic returns that are politically harder to obtain. What are the effects on institutions? Several, and each deserves attention. First, erosion of trust. When credible institutions, universities, courts, scientific bodies are consistently accused of being fronts for dark agendas, public confidence falls. Low trust reduces compliance with public policy and increases cynicism, making democratic reform harder. Second, distraction from structural causes. When a bank collapse is narrated as the work of a cabal, the systemic issues, misregulated derivatives, concentration of risk, moral hazard, are sidelined. Third, normalization of scapegoating. Powerful narratives provide a moral license to target minority groups, NGOs, and journalists. Once those targets are delegitimized, repressive measures are easier to market and enact. Yet the story is not only of decline. There are countervailing forces. Investigative journalism, open data projects, transparency laws, and civic education can pierce the spectacle. A vivid example, an investigative team publishes a clear audit of a privatization deal, showing the network of shell companies. The report, well-sourced, slow burn, may not garner the same immediate virality as a conspiracy clip, but it can change policy, prompt legal action, and create durable records. The civic infrastructure for that work is fragile and underfunded, but it exists. It is the antidote. What would a sensible public strategy look like? First, rebuild institutional transparency.
public procurement databases that are machine-readable, campaign finance disclosures in standardized formats, corporate ownership registries accessible to journalists. Second, media literacy at scale. Not just teaching "don't believe everything online," but training citizens to spot incentive structures, check primary documents, and value corroborated sources. Third, platform accountability that goes beyond content takedowns, a redesign of engagement metrics that does not reward outrage by default. Fourth, support for patient public interest reporting and for institutions that can translate complex facts into narratives without sacrificing accuracy. Finally, remember the psychological dimension.
Humans prefer stories with agency and moral clarity. When policy is complex, myth offers simplicity. Any durable response must respect that psychological reality. Build alternative narratives that are emotionally compelling without being false. Make explanations that are not only accurate but narratively satisfying. Show the human stakes of a tax law or a bailout. Tell stories of people harmed by shadowed policies, not merely abstract charts. The hidden legacy is real, broad, and active. It shapes campaign messages, funds media ecosystems, distorts attention, and alters incentives. The question that remains is not only how the myth persists, but who will mobilize the patient, often tedious work of rebuilding public attention to structural realities. That question points toward the final reckoning. Where does responsibility lie for separating spectacle from governance? And what will you, the viewer, do when the next show begins? The answer is not simple. It begins with curiosity and the willingness to follow inconvenient trails. The last segment will ask the brutal question the entire episode has been building toward. We have followed a story from bonfire to bestseller to algorithm, and noticed the same pattern at each stage. Accusation simplifies, spectacle sells, institutions shrink under attention diverted. You have watched how a medieval political purge became a machine for modern myth-making. You have seen how that machine rewards drama over detail and punishes patience. So here is the question we leave open. If the most dangerous conspiracies are the ones that make us look for conspiracies, who will do the slow, boring work of tracing money, reading contracts, and mapping influence until the real levers of power are illuminated? If you stayed to the end of this paper, thank you. If this episode moved you, subscribe and help us reach the first 1,000 subscribers. We need a community that values patient truth over instant spectacle. Share a detail you learned in the comments. What surprised you most? Where you first heard the myth? And point to the next story you want unmasked. There are many more files to open. This is only the first.